he talked about abolishing national insurance contributions for workers. That is a big unfunded commitment. Nobody's told us where they're going to find that £40 billion.
But he's not saying it's going to. That's like that's an ambition. That's like wanting to date Kylie Minogue, isn't it? That's just a sort of distant. At some point in my life, I'd like to do this type of thing. Really,
let's see what the Prime Minister says about that. I mean, I think that it's certainly something that they want to do, and I think that it does open up an attack line for Labour to say, well, look, hang on a second, you were attacking us for our £28 billion pledge on the Green Prosperity Plan. Now you've got a £40 billion aspiration to end the national insurance contributions. How are you going to pay for that?
Big week for politics. I want to start by talking about, look, we've got big demonstrations in London, particularly today, over Gaza. This week, the Home Office advisor, Mr. Simcox, talked about London being a no-go area for Jews. There was quite a lot of pushback there. What's going on in the government about discussion of extremism? Because I know they've been having quite a fight this week about whether we should redefine extremism, how we should redefine it, what we should do about it, and so on.
I think it's a really difficult thing for them to actually grapple with. And I think you kind of saw that when we heard the Prime Minister do that sort of Downing Street speech just the other week, where he talked about extremism and the need to kind of face it down, as it were. But actually, there wasn't really many tangible things that he suggested that we could do to actually deal with it. And so I think it is something that the government are really grappling with. We're waiting to see what the government's new counter-extremism strategy is going to look like. That's the vehicle that's creating all these tensions at the moment. There's lots of people making different arguments about what should and shouldn't be included. I think what some people are worried about is that it almost becomes a kind of law of unintended consequences, and that things get kind of shoved into that piece of work that effectively shut down freedom of speech.
If you're defining what British values are and sort of define what's against British values, then you've got a whole problem there.
Of things, that could then be quite problematic. So I think they're thinking about it very hard at the moment. There's been all sorts of reviews that have kind of been feeding into that, including on Prevent and the Shawcross review, which has just been happening. I think they're going to take their time on this. I don't think we're going to see anything particularly sort of definitive coming in the next week or so. But I think at the same time, there's an enormous amount of pressure on the police today, given that we've been expecting this protest for a while, that we know it's going to be quite big, and sort of we've heard the Prime Minister himself almost, I almost hesitate to say this, almost reiterating the words of Suella Braverman, who's of course sacked for making similar comments about the police, really urging them to sort of do their job. And if you think she kind of took up the mantle against the Metropolitan Police for not policing these protests properly in the first place, we've seen not quite as strident language from the Prime Minister, but certainly he was expressing frustration, I think, that they weren't always taking the right sides in these protests. So it will be interesting to see what happens today, and if there is a need for any sort of further conversation about the way in which the police manage it.
How much of this, in your reading, is government and how much of this is politics? Is it fair to assume, to recognise that maybe there's a sense in the cabinet, in the Conservative Party, that maybe this is territory on which Labour is vulnerable, because Labour is much more tortured over the response to Gaza than the government is. The government has just sort of been pretty cheerfully pro-Israel right the way through, whereas Labour has been grappling for all kinds of historical reasons with sort of both sides of the argument in a much more tortured way. Is there a sense that this is something on which they can sort of land some blows?
Yes, but I don't think it's necessarily about creating a dividing line with the Labour Party, though that's obviously a kind of positive side benefit, I guess. But I think this is also about them talking to their own party. I mean, let's not forget that when the Prime Minister made that speech on the steps of Downing Street, it came only a few days after Lee Anderson had made those comments about the threat of, as he described it, Islamists, talking specifically about Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, for which he was expelled. And as I think we discussed previously, I think what surprised many people sort of watching that spectacle was just how much support Lee Anderson had from within the Conservative Party, and indeed particularly amongst those red wall Wall MPs. There were sort of a number of front page stories and indeed other dispatches sort of recounting the WhatsApp group messages between those Red Wall MPs who seemed to be saying, actually what Lee said was fundamentally right. He may have been clumsy as they described it, not me, in the way in which he said it. But actually, I think that there is a sort of sense of party management about this, that this is one of the issues where they think that they can speak to the kind of swing voters that perhaps they need to attract to win the next election.
Okay, moving on, budget this week. It's normally quite a big deal. I'm sort of struck by the way that normally after there's a budget, by this point in the sort of weekly cycle, it's starting to fall apart. And that doesn't really seem to have happened in quite the same way as it normally does. Is that because this was a particularly good budget, or is that because this was a particularly empty budget?
It's quite interesting you say that. I kind of think it is unravelling.
I mean, not to the extent that they often do. Not
well,
to the extent
we're not
someone
in
goes,
pasty tax land.
Well, but we're not in a kind of like, oh, there's, sort of 8 billion quid they've forgotten about territory. Or are we?
Well, I actually think that there is going to be a big issue around this. And I think that you're going to see the Labour Party start to make sort of stronger arguments around this, both in the days and weeks ahead. But the Prime Minister is going to speak to us in the Sunday Times this weekend, and we'll be reflecting some of his comments in there. But if you think about what the Chancellor hinted at in the budget, where he talked about abolishing national insurance contributions for workers. That is a big unfunded commitment. Nobody's told us where they're going to find that £40 billion.
But he's not saying it's going to happen. That's like that's an ambition. That's like wanting to date Kylie Minogue, isn't it? That's just a sort of distant, at some point in my life, I'd like to do this type of thing. Really,
let's see what the Prime Minister says about that. I mean, I think that it's certainly something that they want to do. And I think that it does open up an attack line for Labour to say, well, look, hang on a second. You were attacking us for our £28 billion pledge on the Green Prosperity Plan. Now you've got a £40 billion aspiration to end the national insurance contributions. How are you going to pay for that? And I think the intention, as I understand it from the Labour Party, is to make this issue their £28 billion.
Oh, wow. Okay, right. Okay. Well, I mean, look, two more budget questions. The first one being, how did it land among Conservatives, like Conservative MPs? Did it sort of put a bit of spring in their step, or are they just a bit sort of too depressed for anything to do that?
I think that, any budget, whether it is a tax-cutting budget, there will be support. Obviously, the Chancellor has done what they asked him to do, which is to cut taxes. I think there is a level of disappointment that it wasn't income tax. I think that they think that there's more political capital to be had from that. I think there is a kind of issue around the fact that it was national insurance contributions, which obviously pensioners don't pay. So that has had a kind of impact on the feelings around what they're doing towards the grey vote, which, on the basis that not ordinarily they are sort of Conservative supporting, or traditionally they're more Conservative leaning. So I think there's some consternation about why that particular tax was chosen. But look, I mean, there's also a coherent argument to make about why you would cut that particular tax, in terms of the fact that it is a tax on workers. So I think that, the kind of people that are looking at it in a kind of logical fashion rather than a kind of how is this going to help us win the election, will be quite happy with what happened. But I think there is still a sense that people wanted the Chancellor to go further. Right. I also think that there's some concern about the fact that it is difficult to argue that this is a tax-cutting government when, if you look at the overriding figures, which show that actually the tax burden is at the highest level since 1948. And that's quite a difficult argument, I think, to make to the public. I think the public are more aware of that fact, perhaps, than they have been in previous generations, because it has become such a political hot potato. And the issue around fiscal drag in particular has been so high on the political agenda.
It's always dangerous to say you're going to ask two questions because you might forget the second one. But I have not forgotten the second one. And it was to be, some people have been pointing out, including Susie Boniface on the breakfast show this morning, that a lot of this budget feels like it's basically designed to sort of salt the earth for when Labour's in government, to make life a lot harder for them a year from now, a year and a half from now, whatever. Is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, if you think about some of the measures that the Conservatives have effectively taken to pay for their tax rises, including the abolition of the non-dom status, these were things that the Labour Party had announced they were going to do to pay for various things, including breakfast clubs for children and others. And of course, it does mean that now that will have already happened. That funding will have already been sucked into paying for the tax rises, which means that Labour are now going to have to find another way to pay for those things. Yeah,
well, so I guess they'll be cross. Moving on from that just a bit. Did we learn anything this week that gives us more of a guide as to when the next election might be? I know that's the big question.
It
But
is the big
have
question.
your views changed this week?
Not really. I thought if he had done income tax in this budget, I would have been much more on a kind of election footing than I am.
Right.
I think that's the one that they are really keen to do before an election. Of course, the Prime Minister himself said in that first run at the Tory leadership that he wanted to see income tax come down to 16 pence by the end of the next Parliament. He's got quite some way to go to meet anywhere near that pledge. So I kind of have been waiting for that to happen as a kind of signal. But yeah, I mean, there's still a school of thought that this might still happen in May. I think the Prime Minister has made some comments which have sort of dampened that speculation somewhat, suggesting that he's standing by the statement that he made at the beginning of the year, that it would be the second half of the year when we saw an election. But look, I mean, Prime Ministers, as we know, can change their minds rapidly. I remember only too well reporting a story back in 2017 saying that Theresa May was considering a snap general election. It was slapped down very firmly by number 10 at the time. And yet 10 days later, what happened? She got the podium out.
Yeah.
Theresa May got the podium out, put it in front of number 10 and announced an election. So I wouldn't ever hold too much store in what anybody says at any one given time, because I think that things can always change. I hear behind the scenes that there is lots of kind of rumour and trajectory going around the corridors of Westminster at the moment, because lots of leaflets are being published. People also think that if they get the Rwanda bill through the House of Lords any time before the 26th of March, which is the last day upon which May the 2nd election can be called, that might just give them the impetus to do it. But I mean, my instincts still point to the fact that it will be an October election.
But I guess it all depends when you're taking your summer holiday. I guess if we understood
I
that.
am not taking a half-term break. I have not booked
Right.
to take my children away in October half-term, either because I think there'll be an election then, or that we'll have a new government.
Well, that's good enough for me. Look, you mentioned Theresa May. I wanted to ask about her before I let you go. Announced this week that she was standing down. Was this a surprise at all?
It was actually. I'd actually interviewed Theresa May over the summer. It was to coincide with the launch of her book, which was on the abuse of power. And I sat in her kitchen in Maidenhead and asked her that very question about whether she was going to stand down. I mean, my sense from Theresa at the time was that she was living her best life on the backbenches. You know, she cares passionately about her constituency, and she cares passionately about the work that she does. But my sense is she wants to do something slightly different. She's set up her modern slavery task force. This is, of course, something that she's spoken about many, many times before, and I suspect that she wants to go and devote more time to that work. But in my opinion, having spent time with her over the years, she will be a huge loss to the House of Commons. She brings great experience to the backbenches. She has, served in the cabinet in a number of high-profile roles, including Prime Minister, and she's also a lot of fun these days. Her speeches have often won awards for being funny and witty.
So strange.
Particularly when she talked about her meetings with the late Queen, which was strange because she wasn't always the most forthcoming when you used to interview her. I remember that being a very painful time.
Why are they almost always so much more fun when they leave government?
Thing is, I think what happens is people kind of hold on to power by their fingertips. They think that it's the kind of be all and end all. And, she certainly did through those Brexit wars. And I think once you suddenly realise that it's all over and you relinquish that power, you actually realise that you can have all the fun bits and the trappings of the job without all the kind of horrors and responsibilities that come with it. You still have a kind of status internationally, and you still have very much a voice that people listen to. You can go away, you can write books, and you can make high profile interventions on things that you care about. And at the end of the day, you can close the curtains and go to sleep and not have to worry about that phone ringing in the middle of the night to tell you some world crisis has erupted.